This is Science in Parallel, a podcast about people and projects in computational science. I'm your host, Sarah Webb. In Season 6, we've been looking at artificial intelligence applied to engineering and science problems. I've been talking with researchers working on foundation models, a type of AI trained on large data sets and then applied to general problems. ChatGPT and other similar tools are built on large language models, which are one type of foundation model. In this episode, I'm talking with Joel Yee, a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University, who has been working on foundation models for neuroscience. He's particularly interested in how researchers study brain data and is examining brain-computer interfaces. These tools could expand the ways paralyzed patients interact with the world. Joel is a third-year Department of Energy Computational Science Graduate Fellow, and that program supports this podcast. Joel talked about his research and the differences between language data and neural data, and how that could shape where foundation models are useful in this field. Joel, it is great to have you on the podcast.
It's lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Joel, how did you get interested in computing, in neuroscience? What makes this interface of science interesting for you?
I always interacted the world through a lot of my days spent on the computer growing up. I almost struggle to imagine any other sort of major interface to the world. For neuroscience, though, I got into that in maybe the last 5 years. And there I was mostly driven by the potential use cases of really understanding the brain. So that this divides sort of into like a clinical use case because there's lots of neurodegenerative disorders that impact many people as they age. And also there's the kind of neurotech angle, which is what can we do with the kind of brain data and our understanding of the brain for healthy populations through their life. And for me, both of these are really interesting because these types of applications are like health needs. And one of our main sort of frameworks for understanding the brain is that the activity inside our brains is this real distributed computational process where different neurons will interact with each other and different brains interact with each other. And so it's a network of activity. And now AI nowadays is also all about networks of sort of pseudo-neurons interacting with each other. It's kind of a not quite equivalence class between the two things, but there's a lot of interesting overlaps in how we study the two. So there's that.
So talk to me about kind of the core scientific question that you're most interested in answering here at this neuroscience AI interface.
I would probably reframe this in the sense that most of what I'm interested in, I see as almost kind of like systems engineering endpoints rather than scientific questions. And I think this probably applies a little bit pretty broadly for foundation modeling. So there's two sort of takes on this. First, if we focus more on foundation models for neuroscience, which I'm here to talk about today, I think maybe the major question is, how do we create models that provide us effective interfaces to neural data? And the salient thing about neural data is often the fact that the data that we can record and observe in any of our experiments is very partial. It's very limited. We can only interact with parts of the brain at once. And then after an hour, 2 hours, no matter what we're recording from, we kind of need to take a break. And so we'll come back and all of a sudden the brain has changed. Or we're looking at the brain from an entirely new animal or a new person. And so the foundation model hopefully is an interface that will help us consider all of this data holistically. That's sort of one vision. For me personally, I study foundation models, but I also am mostly focused on brain-computer interfaces. And there, again, so for brain-computer interfaces is this application where we are interested in working with neural activity that we record in people, and we want to translate that to motor intention if they're sort of paralyzed and can't move, for example. And there, the question is, how do we create similar systems that are able to reliably and perhaps even adaptively look at their neural data and translate that to their intention? So how can we help users interact with the world?
So it sounds like in part we're talking about the available data and the types of data that you have changed dramatically in addition to the computational tools and all of these other things. And of course, this is true in so many fields of science right now.
That's right. Previously, we would look at neural data and we'd say, okay, for example, I work with single neuron spiking, and we'd say, okay, we can sort of make sense of this and it relates to this external variable, like movement we want to study really clearly. But now there's, I guess, a little bit of anxiety that now we're recording thousands of neurons at once and we can look at all of them, and it's a little bit intimidatingly complex at this point.
How did you get into specifically thinking about foundation models for neural data?
I have been inspired by the direction that we could, but it was almost just a qualitative inspiration rather than like a statistically or theoretically motivated inspiration. The idea that different data sets, not in neuroscience, but in the sort of domains where foundation models first took hold, different language or vision data sets, you'll train a network to do one task and they'll perform surprisingly well on lots of related tasks. And so when we first began collectively as a field to think about, well, what is the promise of this method or these ideas in neuroscience, we would look at different data sets related on these axes I alluded to earlier, like different animals, and say, well, if we train a network in one of these dimensions, does it apply or benefit our modeling of other related data sets? This initial proof of concept is not really what I would call foundation modeling work, but I have been interested in that. And this is all sort of recent thinking in the field in the last 2-3 years, certainly as the machine learning ideas have also matured and become available for researchers outside natural language processing or vision.
Let's dive straight into that in terms of how you think about foundation models and what particularly makes this an avenue that you're pursuing for the questions that you're interested in.
I think the strongest use case for foundation models in neuroscience is data efficiency. Because every time we want to analyze neural data, we're sort of interested in sort of asking, what is the specific relationship of this data that I'm looking at, and how does it help me answer this neuroscientific question, or how does it analyze, how can I draw a relationship to these other covariates or other variables that I collected at the time. Oftentimes, this will take a decent amount of data to characterize because there's lots of variables affecting the specific neural data that we see, and isolating sort of a single relationship within that will sort of require, let's collect this trial a bunch of times, average out the noise. This can be expensive. Experimental time is very valuable. And so as we try to study more complicated behaviors, for example, we'll need to collect more and more data, and this will be intractable. So one of the hopes is that if foundation models can precondition how we analyze a new data set, we can try to accomplish more complicated things within a fixed time frame. That's the case for data efficiency. I'll rewind there and just say, for brain-computer interfaces, there's less of a scientific question, but really concrete metrics around, can we infer what the participant or BCI user is trying to do by having them only collect a few trials of data where they're trying to say, move left, move right. So previously the user would need to say, I'm going to move left 8 times in a row. And okay, now we're starting to get it. We say, can we just get that in 1 or 2 tries? And what this equates to in these practical applications is we can get higher performance with less effort. These types of applications are also relevant in the hospital settings, where clinicians are trying to characterize we have these neural data-based diagnostics, and they'll achieve some performance based on the amount of time we have in the hospital. And we would hope to achieve higher performance with a fixed amount of time.
Can you kind of talk to me about the kind of data that you're working with, particularly for people who are not neuroscientists? What does that look like? And then kind of how does that feed into a model?
So I have spent most of my time working with neuronal spiking activity. How this data originates is we have electrodes that will insert into the brain, and when neurons in the brain fire, they'll sort of distort the electric field around them, and we sort of listen to these electrical field distortions, and when it's a particularly sharp distortion, we know, okay, there's a neuron really nearby our electrode and it has spiked. So there are patterns in the collective spiking of lots of neurons together enmeshed in a web. So we have a bunch of electrodes sitting nearby a bunch of neurons. And so we can come up with what are called these pictures of how a neural population is firing in a coordinated pattern. This is what I'm used to processing for these neural foundation models. and how we would feed these into any specific model, I would say like where foundation models have most clearly been studied in neuroscience has been for like this functional activity of neurons processing things evolving over time. So other common data modalities that are analyzed in foundation models include functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI.
fMRI is built on the same technology as medical MRI. It measures brain activity by detecting changes in blood flow in the tissue.
There are different types of electrodes that people put on depending on like how small the actual electrical contact is with the brain, and this will give you qualitatively different reads on the neural activity. So for example, outside the brain, a fairly popular neural data modality is called electroencephalography, so EEG, which is just people put electrical contacts actually just outside and put contacts on your head, or they'll sometimes have little preparations, but it's essentially just electrodes sitting outside your head. And even then you can still capture some traces of what the brain may be trying to do. And these same techniques and questions come up. So it's an exciting time in terms of like having a same like computational framework to try to study all of these different modalities, even though they occur and have signal over very different time scales and spatial scales.
So talk a little bit about those time scales, because I mean, I'm imagining we're talking about anywhere from fractions of seconds to minutes or longer. Is that a reasonable span, or is the span longer?
I think neuroscience broadly does have to deal with a lot of spatial and temporal scales. I think for most intensive purposes, the actual quickest time scale that most non-cellular neuroscientists might be concerned with is essentially the firing of a single neuronal unit. And that occurs over the time scale of about 1 millisecond.
Okay.
So yes, we're talking about like millisecond time scales of modeling. And for brain-computer interfaces, we're more concerned with like sort of like what is the perceptually noticeable timescale. So that would be on the order of tens to hundreds of milliseconds of how often do we need to process the neural data and do something with that neural data. I think the slowest timescale neural data modalities in terms of our recording technology is maybe something like fMRI, which operates on the multiple seconds timescale.
What are you working on right now?
One of my latest projects has been building a big foundation model for specifically motor cortical data from non-human primates and humans, and to study if we can actually achieve some of the benefits of foundation models, such as data efficiency for motor decoding.
A quick explanation. Motor cortical data comes from the motor cortex, a part of the brain that controls voluntary movements.
That's the main thing. So we'll have pre-recorded motor variables, and we'll have motor cortical activity, and we try to drive the relationship between them. We built a big foundation model for this, and now all the diagnostics in that work pointed relatively positively, but I'm now trying to take this and move it into the main application I'm interested in, which is for brain-computer interfaces. So it actually turns out that there's a big evaluation gap between what we can easily study in the context of like sort of more machine learning centric, like you have a data set you're interested in, sort of like, oh, look, our performance in modeling the relationship between the data in this data set went up, and saying that that model is useful in something like closed loop control.
Closed loop control is a system with 3 parts. For example, a human interacting with a computer screen or a robot arm. The third element is the physical world and the way that the computer or robot changes it. That third piece provides feedback to the human, closing the loop and allowing the human to adjust. By comparison, an open loop system doesn't provide the direct feedback to the user.
So you may have noticed that the adoption of foundation models in robotics has been slower than it has been in the sort of more static domains of language and vision, because there's lots of subtle interactions that are not captured between like the controller, or in robotics it'd be like the robot that's moving around, and its environment. For us, it's sort of the way the human is modulating their neural activity to move, oftentimes still like a robot arm around. And the neural activity essentially that we see during control, when they're sort of like moving it back and forth, is out of distribution for basically these deep network models. And their behavior is not really even constrained. So it's not clear that all the benefits we see in sort of like the well-controlled offline setting of pre-recorded static data sets would translate easily to closed loop control. So in summary, what I'm working on is evaluating the benefits of these pre-trained models for closed loop control.
So what have you learned so far, and what's next?
Well, what I've learned so far is that these are pretty different playing fields, the open loop and closed loop problems. There's a few other directions I can briefly talk about. For example, there's a thing outside of motor control that is also relevant for brain-computer interfaces is sensory stimulation. So in this case, we want to provide these tiny electrical inputs into the neural population that we're seeing so that we can provide the neural change the neural population state. What this feels like is, for example, when a person is moving a robot arm and the robot arm touches a block, they can feel like their finger had a little tap or a little buzz. And this is actually useful for control. It's not sort of just like a phenomena that occurs and it's like pleasant and surprising. It's like people will make use of this sensory feedback to improve how quickly and confidently they will pick up an object when they're moving a robot arm.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of challenges related to how we model the data that occurs when we stimulate the brain region. And there's a potential application of applying basically the same large-scale modeling techniques there as for motor control. It's like a wide open space if we can resolve the issues around motor control well enough. And I think that's a pretty challenging space because when we're talking about sensory stimulation, we will have kind of an exponential design space in what we should do.
What do you see as the limitations of foundation models, either in your work or overall?
Ultimately, the currency for a lot of neuroscience is this insight. And right now, it requires creativity and familiarity with foundation models in order to understand something about neural data through the interface that foundation models provide us. It's like extracting insight from the outside of the model is difficult. Now, there's been a lot of exciting work in natural language processing and computer vision of directly looking at how the model internals are configured to try to extract insight from there. And I think that drives a lot of people's excitement for saying maybe we can understand something about how the model is understanding the data if we investigate which model layers are connected to each other and how they're wired together. However, I think that this is likely to be, I think it's at least as early days for that as it is for the other sort of black box usage of these models. Now, from a model building perspective, for neuroscience specifically, I think that the idea that different data sets have individual unique variability, and that's something that needs to be acknowledged. I think for language, where you're trying to come up with a unified picture of language, underlying laws of how language are generated, essentially how people speak. However, different neural data sets, you're looking at one part of the brain, another part of the brain, and there is maybe a commonality, spikes can't fire infinite times in a row, right? So there is a basic statistical constraint there. But I think that different neural data sets may have a lot of unique variability. And that can make it actually challenging to sort of imagine what a fully unified foundation model for all neural data would look like. In fact, I think it's possible that we may arrive in a world where actually there are maybe not one huge model for all of neural data, but maybe dozens of models for different little areas of neuroscience or things like that.
What advice would you pass along to somebody who is interested in foundation models for neuroscience or systems engineering or other areas of science? What do you think is important to pass along to others?
Yeah, so this I'm actually quite excited to answer. It's an interesting time to be in AI for science. What we see is all of these different fields already very computationally savvy. These are very technical fields. But ultimately, we're seeing the arrival of a somewhat new culture, a machine learning culture. And it takes the adoption of this culture, I think, for foundation modeling overall to succeed. And what do I mean by this culture? I mean a field that has open data and open code and clear evaluations or what we are trying to do. And these three pillars are really fundamentally prerequisites for new people to contribute and enter, right? You need to have some idea of like what the methods are and some idea of like what you're trying to do. Right now, I think lots of fields, including neuroscience, like this culture and this tooling, therefore, is not really available yet, but it's spinning up over like the last 4 or 5 years. Like people are recognizing the importance that like it needs to be really easy for new people, not even like new to neuroscience, but like say like I don't do machine learning now. What am I even supposed to do to sort of try to start to engage? Traditionally, people try to do this by like going to like workshops or like taking classes, but this is like not quite maybe the right strategy for machine learning. So basically, if it's not clear that there's like open resources for you to contribute to for a particular scientific problem of interest, keep checking back. I think over the course of these recent years, these tools are starting to come online. And if you have a machine learning background, I think if you read through some of these scientific papers, you can focus on the methodological shortcomings, which I'm sure there are many because as an interdisciplinary domain, we don't keep up with the latest and greatest technical methods. And so you can either try to apply your expertise there to improve these models, or for example, try to improve code infrastructure, try to formalize data sets and repackage them and define evaluations with them, and basically like try to translate your expertise for the domain. If you are a domain scientist, like a neuroscientist, but you don't do machine learning, we need that expertise to define what is important. I know something like translating the idea that we want to understand something about neural data, or that we like the visual circuit should operate in this manner, into like a metric, it's difficult. But even sort of evaluating the performance, like developing a way to evaluate models on essentially how well they capture your insights or your data, that's really useful.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think is important to mention?
I think in neuroscience, a major shift or acknowledgement that maybe foundation models are useful has not yet happened. And I think that's justified. I don't think that's saying like, oh, people are totally sleeping on this idea. I think right now with the sort of subfield of neural foundation models, we're really trying to figure out like where we're useful, whether the models we're building actually work. And there's a few like narrative beats that need to happen, like some landmark new insight that is developed or some like really incontrovertible like utility of these models. 1 or 2 of these wins, I think, will be necessary for the field to grow more and get established. That's the status point. And then a second idea that I heard recently is that there is an interesting tension between data that is collected for neuroscience and maybe data that is important for neural foundation models. And this is not unique to neuroscience. There's an opinion piece by Michael Bronstein, who works in synthetic biology. So basically, how it translates to neuroscience is the traditional neuroscientific data sets are collected for controlling as many variables as possible in order to make sense of a simple relationship. Whereas oftentimes this can be maybe a little bit stifling for foundation models who can reckon with actually like maybe like there are 10 knobs that are changing at once on our data. And actually that's maybe sort of the type of data we need to study. Complicated, naturalistic is sort of the buzzword in neuroscience, where we're not constraining the mouse to just shake its head left or shake its head right, but let it interact with other mice, for example, or let a monkey sort of move around its environment. That type of data might be much richer. It's also entirely complementary to what traditional methods are able to approach. So that sort of new area of data might be what is necessary for neural foundation models to flourish. And there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem in terms of funding it or incentivizing it, because you're like, I don't want to collect that data because I don't know that foundation models will work. But maybe that's the type of data where foundation models will really flourish.
On that note, Joel, thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure talking with you.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
To learn more about Joel Yee's research at Carnegie Mellon University and to explore more episodes and information about foundation models in science, please check out our show's website at scienceinparallel.org. Science in Parallel is produced by the Krell Institute and is a media project of the Department of Energy Computational Science Graduate Fellowship Program. Any opinions expressed are those of the speaker and not those of their employers, the Krell Institute, or the U.S. Department of Energy. Our music is by Steve O'Reilly. This episode was written and produced by Sarah Webb and edited by Susan Vallet.